Well, good morning. Susan, I hope you are doing well. And I understand we may have had some COVID issues in the class. We don't know how serious those are. We try and keep up, but I'm not quite certain of what the status is. But I will tell you that Susan and I will continue to pray for you on a regular basis. Speaking of Susan, she and I were apart this week. She remained at our Texas camp while I went back to Camp Ozark. Yesterday, on Saturday, I came back to our Texas camp. So we're back together, and I'm thankful for that. In addition, joining us this week at our Texas camp, Camp OTX, will be Van and Deborah. Van is volunteering his, of course, considerable expertise to help us with some video and photography work. And we are more than grateful for the Williams and what all they will be doing to help us out. So keep them in your prayers. We are still in a drought condition here at OTX. It's also hotter than normal. So we would ask you to pray that maybe we can get a little break in the weather and for a little rain as we move forward in this summer. We've now completed 2 weeks of our 10-week summer at Camp Ozark and 1 week of our 9-week summer at Camp OTX. And God has blessed us with safety and good health so far. And for that, we are extremely thankful. I want to thank Dean Forbes for teaching last week. As I understand it, Dean brought some great words and insights from the 23rd Psalm. Today, we're resuming our chronological study of the life and works of Jesus, and we're going to be in the 6th chapter of Mark, beginning with the 14th verse. If you'll remember, Jesus has sent out the 12 on their own for the very first time, and we spent 2 weeks on this previous passage in Mark, learning the 9 principles of ministry that we can glean from this great passage of the scripture. And if you'll remember, those 9 principles of ministry were: first, we're called. There was a calling. Second, we are sent. Jesus sends us to do specific mission work. Third, if he's going to call us and going to send us, he's going to enable us. He's going to give us the tools we need to do that work. Fourth, he always wants us to depend on him for provision. And that's very important to remember. Fifth, he gives us contentment in the work we're doing. Sixth, he gives us and wants us to be discerning in how we minister and to whom we minister. Of course, seventh, very important, all ministry involves proclamation of the gospel. And then 8, all ministry involves caring or compassion. So those were, I said there were 9, those were the 8 principles of ministry that we covered. So now the gospel writer, Mark and Matthew, by the way, they switch gears and bring us back to King Herod. Now, this is not the King Herod that tried to kill all the babies, okay? This is his son. This is Herod Antipas, who was named to the throne of Herod the Great, who was the Herod that tried to kill Jesus after his father died around 4 BC. He ruled over Galilee and Perea. 2 of his other brothers, Philip and Archelaus, ruled different areas because what had happened was Herod the Great had divided his dominion into 3 different regions. So let's pick up the passage in Mark 6:14. Verse 14, King Herod heard about this. What did he hear about? He heard about the great works that Jesus was doing, the great teachings, the great ministry that he was doing. King Herod heard about this, for Jesus' name had become well known. We remember lots of people were flocking to hear and see Jesus and hopefully be healed. Some of the Hebrew people, some were saying John the Baptist has been raised from the dead, and that is why miraculous powers are at work in him. So people were trying to figure out who Jesus was. So Jesus, of course, as I said, was starting to become well known. So Herod became concerned with who this was because he thought he had taken care of John the Baptist. Now, why would John the Baptist need to be raised from the dead? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today, the death of John the Baptist, okay? If in fact it was John the Baptist risen from the dead, this would probably be particularly disturbing to Herod because it would show him that John the Baptist was in fact maybe the chosen one and that Herod had beheaded him and could be trouble for him. So anyway, there was concern. Now, verse 15 tells us that other people were just as perplexed as Herod. Take a look. Others said he is Elijah, and still others claimed he is a prophet like one of the prophets of long ago. So basically what we're seeing here is that Jesus' ministry evoked a wide number of responses. Some said it was John arisen. Some said it was Elijah. Others said it was a prophet. Herod seemed to side with those who thought Jesus was John risen again. This shows that he didn't really reject the supernatural, and he still had some amount of respect and fascination for John, even though he had had him killed. Maybe it was his guilt over executing John that led him to fear John's resurrection. And of course, why was Elijah mentioned? Well, who was Elijah? Arguably the most revered of the prophets, along with Isaiah. Remember, he's the only person that didn't die. He was taken up to heaven in a whirlwind. So it is natural for the Hebrew people to believe something supernatural could occur with Elijah. But as we see in verse 16, Herod himself is certain it's John the Baptist. Verse 16. But when Herod heard this, he said, John, whom I beheaded, has been raised from the dead. Here's a question for you. Why do you think Herod was focused on John the Baptist? Well, I think there's several reasons. We'll get into some of those. But I think one reason, this is just my opinion, is that he had a guilty conscience. He knew he had been weak. He knew he had brought about the execution of someone who was at least a great teacher and powerful, and he felt very guilty for it. And I think, this is just me, that he was certain that he was going to pay for it. Okay, so let me ask you this question. Have you ever had a guilty conscience about anything? I have. How did it affect you? How did it affect your relationship with the parties involved? How did it affect your relationship with God? What did you do about it when you had a guilty conscience? Why don't you talk about that in our discussion time? So why did Herod have a guilty conscience? Let's look at verses 17 to 19. Verse 17. For Herod himself had given orders to have John arrested, and he had him bound and put in prison. Why? He did this because of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, whom he had married. Verse 18. For John had been saying to Herod, quote, it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife, unquote. So Herodias, who was now Herod's wife, nursed a grudge against John and wanted to kill him, but she wasn't able to. So let's make sure we have the background here. Herod and Antipas had divorced his first wife and then taken his brother's wife from him. That was Herodias. And Herodias was actually Herod's own blood niece as well, which made the whole union even more incestuous and messy. So this caused a war with his first wife, who he had divorced, his first wife's father. So here comes John the Baptist, and John publicly condemned Herod for this incestuous and sinful relationship. Obviously, this relationship would have been repugnant to any God-fearing Jew. However, most of them were too afraid to speak up. Not John. The Bible always shows us that John's character is that of one who speaks the truth. He speaks it boldly. He speaks it without fear. He speaks it without worrying about consequences. So we can sure that John wasn't going to turn his back and support the telling of white lies. So in this particular case, speaking out against a powerful ruler like Herod would put a red bullseye on his back. And John knew that. And yet John spoke anyway. Why shouldn't he just be quiet on the issue so that he could deal with other less dangerous issues and prolong his ministry? Why? Because that wasn't John. So that brings up this question. When is it appropriate for you and I to be John? When it is appropriate for us to directly and boldly call out sin? And when we do it, how should we do it? You know, sometimes it is obviously appropriate to wade right into the thick of the things to call out wrongdoing or immorality. Sometimes we can do it more quietly, like Joseph when he found out Mary was pregnant, or Jesus when he acknowledged the sin of the woman at the well that we discussed previously. He didn't go screaming through the rooftops. He dealt with her individually. In this case, both Herod and Herodias were simply evil, and they were immoral people of immense power. And because of that, John felt it necessary to challenge them to their face. And sometimes that is the proper course of action. And if we're to be John at the appropriate time, what does it take? What did John have? The first thing he had was knowledge. John knew what God's law was and what God's law required and what was against God's law. Second, John had an understanding. He knew that this law was being violated on purpose. Third, John was confident. He was confident that he belonged to God. He was confident that he was doing God's work, and he was confident that whether God took him for it or not, he was a win-win. What that gave him, number 4, was courage. And that's what's so important for us. We need to have knowledge. We need to have understanding. We need to have confidence that God's going to provide, and that when we do God's will, it's going to be right, whatever happens. So John had the courage to step up and say, look, you may want to get me for this, but this is the fact. And of course, that courage meant he had great conviction. So when we're going to call out sin, when we're going to call out immorality, I believe those 5 things are requisite: knowledge, understanding, confidence, courage, and conviction. Now remember, Herodias wanted John dead. So why wasn't he dead? I mean, this was the guy's wife. Look at verse 20. Because Herod feared John and protected him, knowing him to be a righteous and holy man. When Herod heard John, he was greatly puzzled by what he said, yet he liked to listen to him. So this is really fascinating. John, by speaking the truth, by living the truth, by just his bold witness, had earned the right to be heard with Herod. Herod listened to him. Okay. He was holy and he was set apart from others. He didn't have observable blemishes. Herod saw this in John and he respected it in him. Look, it said, because Herod feared John and protected him, knowing him to be a righteous and holy man. Uh, and he knew he was just. In other words, Herod knew that John's judgment of good and evil, right and wrong, could be trusted. So what's fascinating to me, this is a bum. Herod Antipas is a bum, okay? But John's witness was making a difference with this man. And what that tells us is this: when we speak the truth, God's truth, not our truth or our opinion of the truth, respect follows. God's word brings respect. It may bring bad consequences, but it brings respect. So in verse 21, meanwhile, we see that Herod's wife is stewing. She can't get the guy killed and put away, even though he's calling her a harlot, because her husband respects the guy. So, verse 21, finally, the opportune time came. On his birthday, Herod gave a banquet for his high officials and military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. This was a power dinner, okay? When the daughter of Herodias came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his dinner guests. So this was all men, all the most powerful men in his ruling dominion. So this beautiful, sexy daughter of Herodias comes in, obviously planned by Herodias, and she dances, and she basically woos the men. For lack of a more crass term, she turns them on, okay? So the king now said to the girl, quote, ask me for anything you want and I'll give it to you. Baby, I'll give it to you. And he promised her with an oath. Then he didn't just say, ask this. He swore an oath on it. And oaths were taken big back then, okay? And he said, whatever you ask, I will give you up to half my kingdom. So this was not uncommon. Up to half the kingdom means, look, I'll do anything for you other than give up my power. I'm not going to give up my power, but I'll do anything else for it. So Herodias, his daughter, she doesn't make a snap judgment decision. We'll come back to that. She went out and said to her mother, what shall I ask for? Well, the mother, now probably having schemed this all along, says very simply, you ask for the head of John the Baptist. So what we find here is Herodias is still angry that she is being branded as a harlot and a slut and a whore, which she truly is, and an adulteress. So we see a couple of things at work here. One is a man acting stupid because of a woman outside of wedlock, because of lust and his hormonal desire. Two, we see a man who's moved by the physical beauty of this woman. He's not considering the consequences of his decision. And both of these things are great lessons for all of us, but particularly for men. Men, don't put yourself in a position to be led astray by the carnal desires of the flesh. How often do we see that happen in churches, in ministry, all the time, okay? It happens all the time, and it causes so much destruction. The Bible itself speaks to this. In 1 Corinthians 6:18, it says, listen, flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a person commits are outside the body, but whoever sins sexually sins against their own body. Listen to the New Living Translation. Run from sexual sin. Did you hear that, man? Run. No other sin so clearly affects the body as this one does. For sexual immorality is a sin against your own body. So look, the worst thing you can do is not run from sexual temptation, even at our advanced age, okay? Then second, sometimes all of us make decisions without using our God-given wisdom and discernment. And therefore, we don't consider the damage and possible consequences of our decisions. So what happens? Look at verse 25. At once, the girl hurried to the king with the request, I want you to give me right now the head of John the Baptist on a platter. Verse 26, the king was greatly distressed. He didn't want to kill John the Baptist. He respected John the Baptist. Now he was put in an unwinnable situation. If he protected him in front of all these powerful guys in the kingdom, he would be considered weak. If he went through with the deal, then he knew he would be doing an injustice and the wrong thing. So the king was greatly distressed, verse 26, but because of his oaths and his dinner guests, he did not want to refuse her. He was a coward. So he had made an oath that he'd give her whatever she wanted, and now he would be forced to keep his word, or people would lose confidence in him. He was so afraid of what he would lose that he refused to do what was right. Now, how many of us have ever done exactly the same? We're so afraid of what we'll lose. Maybe it's a child will get mad at us, or maybe it's material things. I don't know. But we're so afraid of what we would lose that we're afraid to do what is right, okay? Maybe we knew what the right thing to do was, but we were so afraid of the consequences, we didn't have the courage to do the right thing, to right or wrong, to correct an injustice. The main point is to follow the advice in Proverbs 21:5, Luke 14:28, and Proverbs 16:3, which you can look up for yourself after the lesson and discuss those when you're discussing this. But I want to turn to someone that we don't talk about much. What about Herodias's daughter? Can we learn anything positive from her? Does she give us any good example to follow? Well, let me tell you something. To me, interestingly, she is a stark contrast with Herod. She doesn't give a quick answer to ask for a new dress or a piece of jewelry. Instead, she takes her time before making a decision. She goes to consult. She seeks wise counsel. That's great lessons for all of us. And then and only then does she make up her mind. She doesn't do something on impulse, okay? Her motivation seems to come out of a desire to manipulate in order to please her mother and enhance her own position and influence with her. But in the process, it seems to me she shows us an example of thinking something through instead of acting rashly and impulsiveness. A great lesson for all of us. And yet, by choosing the head of John the Baptist, she grossly failed, even though she took time to think it through. Why? Why did she fail after thinking it through? I think the reason is because her motivations and her heart were corrupted by Satan. She wasn't seeking to make a decision that was most pleasing to God, but one that was most pleasing to herself and those that she wanted their favor, her mother. So to me, this is a reminder when we're making important decisions of the process of prayer, of research, getting all the facts, of consulting with wise people, and thinking things through. Now, that said, our heart is important too. You can't do these things just as a checklist and go on with what you wanted the whole time. You have to be truly in your heart, seeking the Lord and open to following him no matter what he asks. No matter what he asks, you have to be willing to follow. So instead of living with the consequences of his own mistake, Herod acted cowardly and perpetuated the wrong. Look at verse 27. So he immediately sent an executioner with orders to bring John's head. The man went, beheaded John in the prison, and brought back his head on a platter. How sick is that? He presented it to the girl, and she gave it to her mother. That's even sicker. And on hearing this, John's disciples came and took his body and laid it in a tomb. John, a man of courage, courage to the death, to be pure, to call out wrongdoing, and to advocate for the right. But you know what? If you look at this whole sordid tale, what it is telling us the way of sin. Sin twists situations so much that there is sometimes no good way out. There was no good way out for Herod. Remember when the Israelites married the foreign women in the time of Ezra? Same thing. Even so, what should John have done? Okay. Should he have done the lesser of two wrongs? He could have said, not John, Herod. He said, I realize I made a promise. That was a mistake. I made it in haste and didn't think it through. I hate to break a promise, but it could be worse to kill an innocent man. Please forgive me, and you can make another request. Okay? This time, I want to hear it first, and if it's good, I will do it for you. He could have atoned for his wrong. He wasn't willing to do that because he thought it would show him to be weak. So he was willing to do exactly what was wrong. Sacrifice a good man's life just so he could be comfortable. It was peer pressure that pushed Herod to kill John. He didn't want to look bad in front of his friends and the powerful people. Look, we need to make sure that we don't do wrong things in order to satisfy other people, powerful or not, so that we don't look bad to them. We need to be pleasers of God rather than pleasers of man. And John is an example of that. He stood up to Herod, even though it would cost him his life. It made Herod mad, but at the same time, it earned Herod's respect in a time when no one would stand up to him or point out the elephant in the room. Finally, think about the banquet. What kind of banquet would a dead person's head be presented on a platter? How sick was this society? What kind of mother would ask her child to make this request? What kind of child would receive this gift and pass it on proudly to her mother? This was a sinful, evil place and a sinful, evil family. And by the way, the world is a sinful, evil place, and the whole world is in desperate need of Christ. So that's it for me. Hope you have a great discussion. We'll talk at you next week when we talk about Jesus feeding the 5,000. Have a wonderful week. Keep us in your prayers. We'll keep you in our prayers with the COVID situation and everything. Pray for Van and Deborah. They're going to be a great help to us. And thanks a lot. We miss you. Bye.